Have you ever wondered what secrets lie beneath the soil of your hometown? What if the ground you walk on every day holds answers to mysteries that have haunted generations? The case we're about to explore today was buried for over a century, quite literally, until a shocking discovery in rural Kansas changed everything we thought we knew about a seemingly innocent wedding that never took place. Before we begin this haunting journey, take a moment to comment where you're watching from. Your support helps this channel continue to uncover these hidden historical horrors that mainstream media refuses to acknowledge. Subscribe now if you haven't already. We need your help to keep bringing these forgotten stories to light. The residents of Willow Creek, Kansas, had always known there was something peculiar about the old Hargrove estate. Standing on the outskirts of town since 1867, the Victorian mansion had weathered dust storms, tornadoes, and the harsh passage of time. But in the spring of 2023, during renovations to the property's eastern garden, construction workers made a discovery that would send ripples through the community and rewrite the history of one of the state's oldest unsolved mysteries. It began with a single bone, a fragment of a human finger that emerged from the dark soil as workers prepared to install a drainage system. By nightfall, authorities had cordoned off the area. By the end of the week, they had unearthed two complete skeletons, buried side by side in what appeared to be a crude, unmarked grave. The remains were positioned in an unusual manner, noted Dr. Eleanor West, the forensic anthropologist called to the scene. The female skeleton was dressed in what we later identified as remnants of a wedding dress, complete with a partially preserved veil. The male skeleton was in a formal suit, typical of the late 19th century. Their hands were bound together with what appears to have been wire, now heavily oxidized. Initial examination suggested they had been in the ground for well over a century. What followed was an extensive investigation that would connect these remains to the disappearance of 22-year-old Margaret Thornton, who vanished without a trace in October of 1889, just 3 days before her wedding to Alexander Fleming, the son of one of Willow Creek's founding families. But here was the first twist that left investigators baffled. The male skeleton found beside Margaret was not Alexander Fleming. The Willow Creek Gazette, dated October 15, 1889, ran the headline, "Local Beauty Vanishes Before Wedding Day, Town in Uproar." The article described Margaret as a woman of uncommon beauty and gentle disposition, and reported that her betrothed, Mr. Alexander Fleming, is beside himself with grief and has organized search parties spanning 3 counties. Historical records showed that Alexander never married after Margaret's disappearance. He remained in Willow Creek until his death in 1937, becoming increasingly reclusive with age. In his will, he left specific instructions that the eastern garden of the Hargrove estate, which his family had purchased in 1892, was never to be disturbed or altered in any way. "It was as if he knew exactly what was buried there," remarked Sheriff Donna Martinez, who oversaw the modern investigation. "And yet all evidence suggests Fleming didn't put those bodies in the ground. So who did? And who was the man buried with Margaret Thornton?" The answer would emerge through a combination of modern forensic techniques and meticulous historical research. DNA extracted from the male skeleton eventually led to a match with the descendants of Thomas Hargrove, the original owner of the estate, and significantly, a man who had left town abruptly in late 1889, supposedly to seek business opportunities in California. Thomas Hargrove was 47 years old at the time of his disappearance, a widower with business connections throughout the Midwest. Historical accounts described him as a gentleman of means with a particular interest in photography, an expensive and relatively uncommon hobby in that era. What those sanitized accounts failed to mention were the rumors that followed Hargrove, whispers about his unusual interest in young women, particularly those about to be married. "We found a hidden compartment in what used to be Hargrove's study," explained Dr. West. Inside were dozens of daguerreotypes, early photographs of various young women. Many were labeled with names and dates. Margaret Thornton's image was among them, dated just 2 weeks before her disappearance. The photographs themselves were disturbing, not for what they showed. The women were fully clothed and posed formally, but for what they represented, an obsession carefully documented and hidden away. Each image captured women in similar poses, with similar expressions of discomfort barely concealed behind forced smiles. And each photograph had been taken without the knowledge of the women's families or fiancés. In Margaret's case, a journal found among Hargrove's possessions revealed the depths of his fixation. The leather-bound book, its pages now yellow and brittle with age, contained entries spanning months before Margaret's disappearance. The writings grew increasingly deranged as her wedding date approached. One entry, dated September 30th, 1889, read, "She acknowledged me today at the Mercantile." A simple nod, but her eyes held recognition. She knows we are destined. Fleming is a fool who could never appreciate her rare beauty, her singular soul. I have prepared everything. Soon we will be together as we were always meant to be. But how did a young bride-to-be end up buried alongside her apparent stalker? The answer lay in the forensic examination of the remains. Margaret's skeleton showed evidence of defensive wounds on the forearms and a blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, signs of a violent struggle ending in murder. Hargrove's remains told a different story. Traces of a powerful sedative commonly used in that era were found in the bone material, suggesting suicide. Our working theory is that Hargrove lured or abducted Margaret to his home, likely under false pretenses, Sheriff Martinez explained. After killing her, whether intentionally or in a struggle, he dressed her in the wedding gown, positioned himself beside her, bound their hands together in a perverse marriage ceremony, and then took his own life. He wanted in death what he couldn't have in life, to be joined with her forever. The discovery sent shockwaves through Willow Creek, but for many descendants of the original settlers, it merely confirmed suspicions that had been passed down through generations. Elizabeth Chambers, 83, great-granddaughter of Alexander Fleming, shared a family secret. "My grandfather told me that Alexander never stopped searching for Margaret. He bought the Hargrove property specifically because he believed that's where she'd been taken. But back then, without evidence, there was nothing the law could do. The Hargroves were powerful, connected. Alexander spent the rest of his life trying to prove what had happened, but he never could get anyone to listen." The investigation revealed another chilling detail. Margaret Thornton wasn't Thomas Hargrove's first victim. Among his personal effects was a leather pouch containing jewelry, wedding rings, engagement bands, and lockets, each tagged with names and dates. Cross-referencing with historical records showed that at least 3 other young women had disappeared from communities where Hargrove had previously lived or conducted business. We are now working with authorities in Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana to re-examine cold cases from that era, noted FBI agent Cassandra Reynolds, who joined the investigation when its multi-state implications became clear. Hargrove appears to have been what we would now classify as a serial killer with a specific victimology: young women on the verge of marriage. The story of Margaret Thornton and Thomas Hargrove might have remained buried forever, if not for the persistent drought that had plagued Kansas in recent years. The unusually dry conditions had caused the ground above the grave to sink slightly, bringing the remains closer to the surface and making them more likely to be discovered during the renovation work. In a way, the land itself was trying to reveal its secrets, remarked Dr. West. Nature has a way of ensuring that the truth eventually comes to light. As authorities continued their investigation, they discovered another disturbing element to the case. Hidden beneath the floorboards of what had been Hargrove's bedroom was a collection of small bottles, each containing different substances. Analysis revealed them to be various sedatives, poisons, and chemicals used for developing photographs. Among them was a vial labeled wedding night, containing traces of a powerful compound that would have induced paralysis while leaving the victim conscious. The implications were horrifying. Hargrove hadn't just planned to kill Margaret. He had intended to keep her alive, but immobilized for some period before her death. The exact sequence of events may never be fully known, but forensic evidence suggests that Margaret fought back with unexpected ferocity, leading to the struggle that ultimately ended her life. A diary belonging to Margaret, preserved in her family's collection of heirlooms, painted a picture of a young woman who had noticed something unsettling about Thomas Hargrove long before her disappearance. Mr. H was at the park again today, sketching the gazebo where Alex and I are to be married, she wrote in August of 1889. He pretends not to notice me, but I feel his eyes following wherever I go. I've told Alex that the man makes me uncomfortable, but he says Mr. H is respected in the community and that I am being fanciful. Perhaps I am. The wedding preparations have left me with frayed nerves. Subsequent entries showed her growing unease. Received an anonymous gift today, a silver hairbrush of exquisite craftsmanship. Mother is delighted, thinking it must be from Alex's family, but he denied knowledge of it when I inquired. I cannot explain why, but the thought of using it fills me with dread. And later, saw Mr. H watching the house from across the street yesterday evening. When Father went to confront him, he claimed to be admiring the architecture. I'm keeping my curtains drawn now, even in the heat of the day. Her final entry, dated October 10th, the day of her disappearance, read simply, "A note came today requesting my presence at the Hoffman dressmaker's shop for a final fitting. A surprise arranged by Alex," it said. "I go this afternoon, though it seems strange that Mrs. Hoffman would schedule so late in the day." Investigators now believe this note was Hargrove's lure, a forgery designed to separate Margaret from her family and draw her into his trap. The dressmaker's shop, located at the edge of town, would have required Margaret to pass by the secluded lane leading to the Hargrove estate. What makes this case particularly haunting is the evidence that Alexander Fleming came tantalizingly close to discovering the truth. After purchasing the Hargrove property, he conducted extensive renovations throughout the house, but oddly left the eastern garden untouched, even building a fence around it and planting dense shrubbery that effectively screened it from view. We found a hidden compartment in Fleming's desk containing a hand-drawn map of the property, explained Sheriff Martinez. The eastern garden was marked with a single question mark. He suspected something was buried there, but likely couldn't bring himself to discover the worst. Or perhaps he felt that disturbing the site would be a final desecration of Margaret's memory. Among Alexander Fleming's personal papers was a letter he never sent, addressed to the county sheriff and dated 1893. "I have reason to believe that Thomas Hargrove was responsible for the disappearance of my betrothed Margaret Thornton. In the course of renovating his former residence, I have discovered disturbing evidence of his unhealthy fixation with her, including multiple photographs taken without her knowledge. I hesitate to disturb what may be her final resting place without official sanction, but I implore you to investigate this matter with the gravity it deserves." The letter was never delivered, perhaps because Fleming knew that without concrete evidence, his claims would be dismissed as the desperate theories of a grieving man. Instead, he chose to stand guard over Margaret's unmarked grave for the rest of his life. As news of the discovery spread through Willow Creek and beyond, other disturbing connections began to emerge. Historians noted that Thomas Hargrove had been a founding member of a now-defunct photography society that counted among its members several men who had been suspected, though never convicted, of crimes against women in various states. We're looking at the possibility that this was more than the action of a single deranged individual, Agent Reynolds revealed. There may have been a network of men with similar obsessions who communicated and even encouraged one another. The Photography Society may have been a cover for something far more sinister. This theory gained credence when investigators discovered coded messages in the margins of letters exchanged between Hargrove and other society members. While many of the references remain obscure, cryptographers identified patterns suggesting a shared language for discussing potential victims and methods of abduction. One letter, dated July 1889, contained the phrase, "Have identified a perfect subject for our autumn collection. Wedding white will complement her dark hair admirably." The sender, a man named Edward Bishop from St. Louis, had been questioned but never charged in connection with the disappearance of two young women in that city. These men were hiding in plain sight, noted Dr. Amelia Rodriguez, a criminal psychologist consulted on the case. They used their social standing and the respect accorded to artistic pursuits as a shield for predatory behavior. In an era before modern policing techniques, before the concept of serial killers was understood, they operated with virtual impunity. Perhaps most disturbing was the realization that the Hargrove estate itself had been designed with concealment in mind. As architectural historians examined the original blueprints, they discovered hidden passages, false walls, and at least two secret rooms not visible from the exterior of the house. The east wing, in particular, contained a chamber accessible only through a concealed door in the master bedroom closet, explained historical preservationist Dr. James Whitaker. This room had no windows and was completely soundproofed with multiple layers of material between the walls. It would have been impossible for anyone inside to be heard from the main house, let alone by anyone outside the property. Within this hidden room, investigators found scratches on the wall, dozens of small marks that, upon analysis, appeared to have been made with a hairpin or similar object. Forensic archaeologists determined that the marks formed a pattern, 5 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal slash, repeated over and over. They were tally marks, counting days. "Someone was kept in that room against their will," Sheriff Martinez stated grimly, "and they were there long enough to need to keep track of time passing." Was this where Margaret spent her final days? The evidence suggests this possibility, though the precise timeline remains unclear. What is certain is that Thomas Hargrove had created a house designed to hide horrors, a respectable facade concealing spaces built specifically for imprisonment and suffering. As winter descended on Willow Creek, bringing with it the first snowfall of the season, the excavation of the eastern garden continued under heated tents. What they found beneath the original gravesite sent the investigation in an even more disturbing direction. There were older remains, Dr. West confirmed, partial skeletons of at least 3 other individuals, all female based on our analysis, all buried at different depths. The deepest burial appears to date back to approximately 1870, just 3 years after the house was built. This discovery transformed understanding of the case entirely. Thomas Hargrove hadn't suddenly developed his obsession with Margaret Thornton. The Hargrove estate had been a killing ground almost from its inception, with young women disappearing at intervals of approximately 5 to 7 years. He was methodical, Agent Reynolds noted. He would select a victim, spend months or even years planning, then act. Afterward, he would often relocate temporarily, claiming business trips or extended family visits before returning to Willow Creek once the initial investigation had died down. The investigation took another turn when a local historian brought forward a collection of newspaper clippings preserved by her grandmother. These yellowed fragments documented a pattern across the Midwest. Young women vanishing shortly before their weddings, their disappearances often coinciding with periods when Thomas Hargrove was known to be in the vicinity. We've now identified at least 11 potential victims spanning a 20-year period, Agent Reynolds confirmed. This places Hargrove among the most prolific serial killers in American history, operating decades before such terminology even existed. The case attracted attention from criminologists nationwide, many of whom traveled to Willow Creek to study what was quickly becoming known as the wedding dress murders. The pattern that emerged was one of escalation, Hargrove's methods growing more elaborate and ritualistic over time, culminating in his final act with Margaret Thornton. The earlier burials were utilitarian, bodies simply placed in the ground without ceremony, explained Dr. Rodriguez. But with each victim, the ritual aspect became more pronounced. By the time he abducted Margaret, he had developed an elaborate fantasy centered around a wedding ceremony that would eternally bind him to his victim. This explained the wedding dress, the bound hands, the position of the bodies. In his deranged mind, Hargrove had created a perverse marriage in death. But why had he taken his own life when he hadn't done so with previous victims? The answer appeared to lie in Margaret's unexpected resistance. Unlike his previous victims, many of whom had likely been sedated before they could fight back, Margaret had somehow managed to struggle against her captor. The defensive wounds on her skeleton and the evidence of a violent confrontation in what had been Hargrove's bedroom suggested she had fought with unexpected ferocity. "We believe she may have injured him significantly during the struggle," Dr. West theorized, "perhaps severely enough that he knew he couldn't escape or fabricate an alibi. Facing exposure and capture, he chose to end his life alongside his final victim." But the investigation wasn't complete. As researchers delved deeper into historical records, they discovered another chilling connection. Thomas Hargrove hadn't acted alone. Among the documents recovered from the hidden room in the East Wing was a small, leather-bound ledger containing names, dates, and locations, many corresponding to known disappearances of young women across multiple states. More disturbingly, some entries were initialed by different hands, suggesting a rotation or sharing of responsibility among multiple individuals. We're now investigating the possibility that Hargrove was part of a larger network of killers, Agent Reynolds confirmed. Men who shared similar fantasies and possibly even traded techniques or locations. Some of the coded correspondence we've discovered suggests they may have sometimes worked in pairs, one selecting the victim while the other provided an alibi. This theory cast new light on Edward Bishop and other members of the Photography Society. Were they merely correspondents, sharing Hargrove's dark obsessions, or active participants in a coordinated campaign of abduction and murder that spanned decades and multiple states? As investigators followed this thread, they discovered that many of the Society members had purchased properties with similar characteristics: rural locations, extensive grounds, architectural features designed for privacy and concealment. Several had east-facing gardens or designated areas of their estates that remained curiously undeveloped. We are now coordinating with authorities in 7 states to identify properties formerly owned by members of this network, Agent Reynolds stated. Ground-penetrating radar surveys are being conducted at multiple locations. This may be just the beginning of a much larger series of discoveries. For the residents of Willow Creek, the case had transformed their understanding of their town's history. The quaint Victorian mansion that had been featured on historical tours and local postcards was now revealed as a house of horrors, a killing ground that had operated for decades while the community remained unaware. "You think you know the history of where you live," remarked Mayor Helen Crawford at a press conference, "but every community has its secrets, its dark chapters. What's important is that we're finally bringing truth to light and giving long overdue justice to these women who were stolen from their families and their futures." As for Margaret Thornton and the man found beside her, their remains were finally laid to rest in the Willow Creek Cemetery, with proper headstones and a memorial service attended by their descendants. Margaret was buried in the plot that had been purchased for her and Alexander Fleming in 1889. The marriage that never took place, finally honored over a century later. But even as the community began to process this dark chapter of its past, the investigation continued to uncover new horrors. The network of killers that had operated with impunity through the late 19th century had connections reaching into prominent families across the Midwest. Some descendants of these men still held positions of influence in their communities. "We've received unusual resistance to parts of this investigation," Agent Reynolds noted cryptically. "Certain records have gone missing from archives. Witnesses have been reluctant to speak. It suggests that even after all this time, there are people who don't want the full truth to emerge." This raises disturbing questions. How far did this network's influence extend? Were there those who knew of these crimes but chose to look the other way? And most unsettling of all, did the network truly die with Thomas Hargrove and his contemporaries, or did it evolve, finding new members to carry on its twisted traditions? The discovery of a photograph album in the Hargrove estate's attic suggested this terrible possibility. The album contained images spanning from 1870 to 1920, decades past Hargrove's death. All featured young women photographed without their knowledge, many wearing wedding attire or formal dress. The later photographs were taken with more modern equipment but showed the same unsettling attention to detail, the same focus on unsuspecting subjects. Someone had continued Hargrove's work long after his death. We're now investigating several cold cases from the early 20th century that may be connected to this network, confirmed Sheriff Martinez. The pattern of disappearing brides didn't end in 1889. It just became more careful, more hidden. As snow blanketed the excavation site, temporarily halting further examination of the grounds, the town of Willow Creek found itself at the center of what was quickly becoming known as one of the most significant cold case breakthroughs in American history. The national media descended, satellite trucks lined Main Street, and historians and criminologists arrived daily to study what one expert called the dark tapestry of America's unacknowledged history of violence. But the most chilling discovery was yet to come. As investigators continued to sift through the Hargrove estate's extensive collection of documents, photographs, and personal effects, they uncovered a false bottom in an antique trunk stored in the attic. Within this hidden compartment lay a collection of thin, leather-bound volumes, journals spanning from 1870 to 1917, all written in the same meticulous hand. The final journal, dated 1917, was penned just days before Thomas Hargrove's son, Edward Hargrove, was found dead of an apparent suicide in the same eastern garden where his father had buried himself with Margaret Thornton. Edward, who had been just 14 when his father died, had grown up to become a respected businessman with connections throughout the region, and, it now appeared, the inheritor of his father's darkest obsessions. These journals document decades of stalking, abduction, and murder, explained forensic psychologist Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who was brought in to analyze the writings. They reveal not just the crimes themselves, but the twisted ideology behind them. Thomas Hargrove believed he was preserving the purity of young women by preventing their marriages, keeping them forever as brides, but never wives. He passed this belief system to his son, who continued the family's terrible legacy. The journals detailed a philosophy that defied rational understanding, a belief that by killing these women at the threshold of their married lives, the Hargroves were somehow saving them from what they perceived as the degradation of marriage. Each woman was carefully selected, studied from afar, and ultimately preserved through death in a perverse ceremony that grew more elaborate with each victim. What we're seeing is the intergenerational transmission of not just violent behavior, but an entire delusional system, Dr. Mitchell noted. Edward Hargrove's writings show that he truly believed he was fulfilling a sacred mission begun by his father, a mission that justified any act, no matter how horrific. The journals also confirmed the existence of a wider network, men who shared the Hargroves' obsessions and sometimes participated directly in their crimes. This network referred to itself as the Preservationists and maintained connections through coded correspondence and occasional meetings disguised as photography exhibitions or scientific gatherings. We've identified at least 17 men who were active members of this group between 1870 and 1920, revealed Agent Reynolds. Some were wealthy businessmen, others doctors, lawyers, even a judge. They operated across state lines and used their social positions to deflect suspicion whenever it arose. Most disturbing of all, the journal suggested that the preservationists had developed a system for identifying and recruiting new members, often targeting impressionable young men from prominent families who showed certain psychological traits the group found desirable. Edward Hargrove's journals documented his own awakening under his father's tutelage and his subsequent efforts to identify suitable candidates for initiation into the group. This wasn't just a father passing his pathology to his son, explained Dr. Mitchell. This was an organized effort to perpetuate a system of predation across generations, a deliberate attempt to ensure that their activities would continue even after the founding members were gone. This revelation led investigators to question whether the preservationists had truly disbanded after Edward Hargrove's death, or whether it had simply evolved, adapting its methods to changing times while maintaining its core ideology. The answer came from an unexpected source. Among the items recovered from the Hargrove estate was a collection of correspondence between Edward Hargrove and various young men from prominent families throughout the region. These letters, dating from 1910 to 1917, contained careful hints about special knowledge and higher understanding that Edward was willing to share with select individuals who showed the right sensibilities. One of these correspondents was Richard Townsend, the son of a banker from Topeka, who had spent several summers at the Hargrove estate as a young man. After Edward's death, Richard had gone on to become a successful photographer, whose work had been featured in exhibitions throughout the Midwest. His specialty was bridal portraits. "We've located Townsend's former residence in Topeka," Sheriff Martinez announced at a press briefing in early January. "The current owners have granted us permission to conduct a thorough examination of the property, including ground-penetrating radar surveys of the gardens and grounds." What they found beneath Townsend's immaculately maintained rose garden sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The remains of 4 young women, all buried between 1920 and 1943, all positioned in the same distinctive manner as the victims at the Hargrove estate, dressed in wedding attire, hands folded across their chests, each wearing a silver ring on the 4th finger of their left hand. "This confirms our worst fears," Agent Reynolds stated grimly. "The preservationists continued their activities well into the 20th century. And given the methodical way these organizations operate, we have to consider the possibility that they recruited new members before the last generation died out." This possibility gained credence when investigators discovered a photograph taken at Richard Townsend's funeral in 1948. Among the mourners was a young man identified as James Mercer, Townsend's apprentice and the inheritor of his photography business. Mercer had gone on to establish studios in several Midwestern cities before his death in 1982. "We are now investigating properties associated with Mercer and others who had connections to known members of the preservationists," explained Agent Reynolds. "This includes not just their homes, but businesses, vacation properties, and land holdings that might have provided the privacy needed for their activities." The investigation had expanded beyond anything initially imagined, from a single cold case to a sprawling, multi-generational conspiracy that had claimed dozens, perhaps hundreds of victims across more than a century. The implications were staggering. How many unsolved disappearances, how many cold cases gathering dust in police archives might be connected to this network? As winter gave way to spring in Willow Creek, the eastern garden of the Hargrove estate had been transformed into an archaeological excavation site. Teams of forensic anthropologists carefully sifted through the soil, documenting and preserving every fragment of evidence that might help identify victims or connect their deaths to specific perpetrators. "What we're doing here isn't just solving crimes," Dr. West explained to a documentary crew filming the excavation. "We're recovering lost history, giving names and stories back to women who were erased, not just from life, but from memory. Every bone, every artifact we uncover helps restore their humanity and brings them one step closer to justice." The work was painstaking and emotionally taxing. Many of the remains had deteriorated significantly over the decades, making identification difficult. But advances in forensic science, combined with genealogical research and historical records, had allowed investigators to put names to several of the victims. Women whose disappearances had long been relegated to footnotes in local histories or family legends. Among them was Catherine Donovan, 20 years old when she vanished from her family's farm outside Willow Creek in 1872. Historical accounts described her as a spirited young woman with a gift for music, who was engaged to be married to her childhood sweetheart when she disappeared while gathering wildflowers near the creek that gave the town its name. For over a century, her family had preserved her memory through stories passed down through generations. Tales of a young woman who dreamed of traveling to New York to study piano, who had sewn her own wedding dress with fabric ordered specially from St. Louis, who had vanished without trace just weeks before her wedding day. "My grandmother used to tell me about her great-aunt Catherine," shared Martha Simmons, 81, a direct descendant of Catherine's sister. "Every generation of our family has named a daughter after her, keeping her memory alive even when the official record forgot her. To finally know what happened to her, it's heartbreaking, but it's also a kind of peace. She wasn't forgotten, and now she isn't lost anymore." Similar stories emerged as other victims were identified, women whose lives and futures had been stolen, whose families had never abandoned hope of learning their fates. For many descendants, the discoveries brought a complex mixture of grief and relief, the pain of confirmed tragedy tempered by the closure of finally knowing the truth. But as spring progressed, the investigation took yet another disturbing turn. Among James Mercer's effects, preserved by his widow, was a collection of photographs documenting gatherings of what appeared to be a photography club active in the 1960s and 70s. These images, innocent at first glance, took on sinister significance when researchers identified several of the members as men who had connections to earlier preservationists through family ties or mentorship relationships. We're looking at the possibility that this organization continued to evolve and adapt well into the latter half of the 20th century, Agent Reynolds confirmed. They became more careful, more sophisticated in concealing their activities, but the core ideology appears to have remained intact. This led investigators to examine unsolved disappearances from the 1960s through the 80s with fresh eyes, looking for patterns that might connect to the preservationists' established victimology. They soon identified several cases that fit the profile. Young women who vanished shortly before their weddings, often last seen heading to bridal fittings, photographers' studios, or similar wedding-related appointments. One such case was that of Laura Mitchell, 23, who disappeared from Lawrence, Kansas in 1974, while on her way to a final dress fitting 3 days before her wedding. Her car was found abandoned at a rest stop along Highway 40, with no signs of struggle or foul play. The case had gone cold after an intensive but fruitless investigation. We've reopened Laura's case and are examining it specifically for connections to known or suspected members of the preservationists active during that period, confirmed Detective Marcus Johnson of the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. We're also conducting a search of a property in rural Douglas County that was owned by a member of Mercer's photography club at the time of Laura's disappearance. The property in question had once belonged to William Sutton, a banker and amateur photographer who had studied briefly under James Mercer in the 1960s. Sutton had died in 1998, and the property had changed hands several times since then, currently functioning as a bed and breakfast known for its picturesque gardens and Victorian architecture. With the cooperation of the current owners, investigators began a careful examination of the grounds, particularly focusing on an area that had originally been a rose garden but had been converted to a patio and fire pit by a previous owner in the early 2000s. The ground-penetrating radar showed anomalies consistent with disturbed soil, approximately 4 feet below the current surface, explained forensic archaeologist Dr. Lena Patel. When we removed the patio stones and began excavation, we discovered a layer of concrete had been poured directly over what appears to be a burial site. Breaking through this concrete barrier, an innovation not seen at previous preservationist burial sites, revealed human remains later identified through dental records as those of Laura Mitchell. She had been buried in her wedding dress, hands folded over her chest, wearing both her engagement ring and a silver band identical to those found on victims at the Hargrove and Townsend properties. This confirms that the preservationists remained active at least into the 1970s, Agent Reynolds stated, and they had evolved their methods, taking additional precautions to ensure their victims remained hidden. The concrete layer was deliberately poured to prevent the ground from settling and creating the kind of depression that eventually led to the discovery at the Hargrove estate. This evolution in methodology raised a troubling question. If the preservationists had adapted their techniques over time, becoming more sophisticated in concealing their crimes, was it possible they were still active? Had this century-long chain of murder and obsession continued into the present day, with new generations taking up the mantle of their twisted predecessors? The investigation shifted to focus on identifying possible contemporary members of the group. This proved challenging. Unlike their historical counterparts, who had left behind journals, correspondence, and photographs, any modern incarnation of the preservationists would likely be far more careful about creating incriminating evidence. We're looking for digital footprints now, rather than physical ones, explained cybercrime specialist Agent Tasha Williams. Forums, encrypted messaging apps, private social media groups, anywhere these individuals might connect and communicate while maintaining anonymity. The breakthrough came not through high-tech surveillance but through old-fashioned police work. A detective reviewing cold cases in Nebraska noted similarities between the historical preservationist cases and the more recent disappearance of Melissa Warren, 24. Who had vanished from Omaha in 2018 while shopping for wedding accessories. Melissa's fiancé, David Carson, had reported her missing when she failed to return from a trip to a bridal boutique. Her car was found in the boutique's parking lot, but security cameras showed her leaving the store and being approached by a man who appeared to be taking photographs of the shopping center. After a brief conversation, Melissa had followed the man around the corner of the building, out of camera range. Neither had reappeared on any of the security footage. The man approached her with a camera, showed her something on it, and she went with him willingly, noted Detective Sarah Powell, who had been assigned to review the case. It's possible he used a technique we've seen documented in the historical cases, showing potential victims photographs of themselves they didn't know had been taken, claiming to be working on a bridal magazine or similar publication. This method, approaching women under the guise of legitimate photography work related to weddings, had been described in Edward Hargrove's journals as an effective way to gain a victim's trust and separate them from public areas without raising suspicion. The unidentified photographer from the security footage became the focus of an intense investigation. Enhanced images were circulated to law enforcement agencies throughout the Midwest, and facial recognition software was used to search driver's license databases and social media platforms. We got a hit from a photography blog, Agent Williams revealed. The same individual appeared in photos taken at wedding industry trade shows in 5 different states over the past 3 years. He was using different names at each event, but has been identified as Robert Crane, 34, a freelance photographer based in Kansas City. Further investigation revealed that Crane had family connections that raised immediate red flags. His maternal grandfather was William Sutton, the same man whose property had concealed Laura Mitchell's remains. Though Sutton had died when Crane was just 7 years old, family photographs showed the boy had spent significant time with his grandfather, often accompanying him to photography exhibitions and helping in his darkroom. We're looking at the possibility of direct transmission of the preservationist's ideology from Sutton to his grandson, explained Dr. Mitchell. This would represent the continuation of a pattern we've seen throughout this investigation. Older members identifying young relatives with similar psychological profiles and gradually indoctrinating them into the group's beliefs and practices. When authorities moved to question Crane, they discovered he had abandoned his Kansas City apartment days earlier, leaving behind few personal possessions. However, a search of the premises revealed a hidden compartment in a closet wall containing dozens of memory cards, each meticulously labeled with women's names and dates. The images on these cards were all of young women photographed without their knowledge, Agent Reynolds confirmed. Many were captured outside bridal shops, at wedding venues during other ceremonies, or in public places. The most recent dates were from just 2 weeks before our search. More disturbing was a leather-bound journal found concealed within a hollowed-out photography reference book. Written in a careful hand, reminiscent of the Hargrove journals, it contained entries detailing Crane's thoughts and observations about various women he had photographed, focusing particularly on brides-to-be he deemed worthy of preservation. The language is nearly identical to that used by Thomas Hargrove over a century earlier, noted Dr. Mitchell. The same rationalization, the same obsessive attention to detail, the same fundamental delusion about saving these women from marriage by preserving them in an eternal bridal state. It's as if the ideology has been passed down virtually unchanged, despite the passage of time. But Crane's journal contained something the earlier preservationist writings had not: references to other members, identified only by initials, scattered across multiple states. The entries suggested an organized network with established protocols for communication, victim selection, and what they termed the preservation process. "We're not dealing with a lone actor," Agent Reynolds stated grimly. "We're looking at a contemporary version of the preservationists with potentially multiple active members. And based on the journal entries, they appear to have modernized their methods while maintaining their core ideology." This revelation transformed what had begun as a historical cold case investigation into an urgent manhunt. A multi-agency task force was established, combining resources from the FBI, state police organizations across the Midwest, and local law enforcement agencies in areas where preservationist activity was suspected. As the investigation intensified, another disturbing pattern emerged. Over the past decade, at least 7 young women had disappeared under similar circumstances across 5 Midwestern states, all within days of their planned weddings, all last seen in connection with wedding-related activities, all without signs of struggle or evidence of conventional abduction. These cases hadn't been previously connected because they crossed jurisdictional boundaries and occurred months or years apart, explained Agent Reynolds. But when we overlay them with locations mentioned in Crane's journal and the travel patterns of suspected preservationist members, clear patterns emerge. The race was now on to identify and locate these modern preservationists before they could claim another victim. The task force established surveillance on wedding venues, bridal shops, and related businesses throughout the region. while cybercrime specialists monitored photography forums, wedding planning websites, and social media platforms for signs of preservationist communication or victim selection. The breakthrough came in early May when a bridal shop owner in Des Moines, Iowa, reported a suspicious interaction with a man claiming to be a photographer for a wedding magazine. The description matched Robert Crane, and surveillance footage confirmed his identity. More importantly, it showed him observing a young woman later identified as Jessica Harper, 26, who was scheduled to be married the following weekend. "We established protective surveillance on Ms. Harper immediately," Agent Reynolds reported. "At no point was she left unguarded, though we maintained enough distance that neither she nor Crane would be aware of our presence." The strategy paid off 3 days later when Crane approached Harper in the parking lot of her apartment complex, again posing as a photographer conducting a feature on summer weddings. As in the security footage from Melissa Warren's disappearance, he showed Harper something on his camera that appeared to capture her interest. He had photographs of her that had been taken without her knowledge over the previous 2 weeks, explained Agent Williams. Shopping for her wedding dress, having dinner with her fiancé, even jogging in the park near her home. This technique creates an immediate sense of vulnerability while simultaneously establishing the photographer as someone with special knowledge or interest in the victim. As Harper followed Crane toward his vehicle, task force members moved in, apprehending him without incident and securing his camera and other equipment. A search of his car revealed a hidden compartment containing sedatives, restraints, and a silver ring identical to those found on historical preservationist victims. Under interrogation, Crane initially maintained his cover story, insisting he was simply working on a legitimate photography project. But when confronted with evidence from his journal and the materials found in his vehicle, he began to reveal aspects of the modern preservationist network, though whether out of a desire to cooperate or a need to boast about the scope and sophistication of the organization remained unclear. "It's bigger than you think," he told investigators. "We're everywhere. We've always been everywhere. My grandfather showed me the truth when I was a child, and that truth has been passed down through generations. We're not monsters. We're saviors. These women deserve to be preserved in their moment of perfect beauty before marriage corrupts them." Perhaps most chilling was Crane's absolute conviction in the righteousness of his actions, the same unwavering belief evident in the journals of Thomas Hargrove more than a century earlier. The ideology had remained intact across 5 generations, adapted to modern circumstances, but fundamentally unchanged in its core delusion. This level of ideological consistency across such an extended time frame is almost unprecedented, noted Dr. Mitchell. Most criminal organizations or cults evolve significantly over time or dissolve when key leaders die or are captured. The preservationists appear to have maintained both operational continuity and ideological purity for over 150 years. Crane's arrest led to the identification of 3 other active preservationists in different states, all of whom had connections to historical members through family relationships or mentorship. Searches of their properties yielded additional evidence, including photographs of potential victims, journals documenting their twisted philosophy, and in one case, a hidden room designed for holding captives, a modern version of the soundproofed chamber discovered in the Hargrove estate. Most significantly, the investigation led to the location where Melissa Warren and 2 other recent victims had been buried, a remote property in rural Missouri owned by a shell company that investigators traced to one of the arrested preservationists. Ground-penetrating radar revealed 3 burial sites beneath a recently constructed workshop, each covered with a layer of concrete similar to that found at the Sutton property. "We believe we've identified and apprehended the core of the contemporary preservationist network," Agent Reynolds stated at a press conference announcing the arrests. However, Given the historical pattern of this organization and its demonstrated ability to perpetuate itself across generations, we're continuing to investigate possible connections and additional members who may remain at large. For the families of the victims, both historical and recent, the investigation had brought long-awaited answers and the possibility of closure. Memorial services were held in communities throughout the Midwest as remains were identified and returned to descendants for proper burial. In Willow Creek, where the investigation had begun, a permanent memorial was established on the grounds of what had once been the Hargrove estate. The property itself, deemed too contaminated with traumatic history to serve any positive purpose, was demolished, the materials carefully removed, and the land reclaimed as a public garden dedicated to the memory of all those who had fallen victim to the preservationists over the decades. This space, which once concealed so much horror, will now stand as a testament to the resilience of truth, declared Mayor Crawford at the memorial's dedication. The light of discovery has finally penetrated more than a century of darkness, and while we cannot undo the terrible acts committed here, we can ensure that these women are remembered not as victims, but as individuals whose lives and futures were stolen from them. The garden was designed with a central monument listing the names of all identified victims, surrounded by flowering plants chosen to represent the states where they had lived. At the entrance, a plaque bore a simple inscription, "For those who were taken before their time, that they may now rest in peace. For those who remain missing, that they may yet be found. And for those who seek to preserve life rather than destroy it, that they may stand as guardians against the darkness that hides in plain sight." For the investigators who had worked the case, the resolution brought a mixture of satisfaction and somber reflection. The scope of what they had uncovered, a multi-generational conspiracy responsible for dozens of murders across more than a century, was unlike anything in modern criminological experience. This case rewrites our understanding of how criminal organizations can evolve and persist, noted Dr. Rodriguez. The preservationists created a system for identifying and recruiting new members that allowed them to survive the deaths of their founders and adapt to changing times. It raises profound questions about other historical crimes we've assumed were isolated incidents. How many might actually be connected through networks we've failed to identify? In the aftermath of the investigation, cold case units across the country began re-examining unsolved disappearances with new attention to possible patterns that might have been missed. The methodology developed during the preservationist investigation, combining forensic archaeology, genealogical research, historical analysis, and modern investigative techniques, became a model for approaching long-dormant cases. What we've learned from this case is that the passage of time doesn't have to mean the end of justice, reflected Sheriff Martinez. These women waited more than a century to be found, to have their stories told, to have their killers held accountable. It's a reminder that for those of us in law enforcement, no case is ever truly closed until the truth is known. But perhaps the most profound impact of the case was on the town of Willow Creek itself. What had begun as a shocking discovery had evolved into a community-wide reckoning with history, an acknowledgement that beneath the quaint facade of small-town America often lie darker truths that successive generations have chosen to ignore or forget. Every town has its secrets, noted local historian Eleanor Thompson. But what makes Willow Creek different is that we've chosen to confront ours, to bring them into the light, to acknowledge the horror while honoring the victims. That's how healing begins, not by burying the past, but by excavating it, examining it honestly and learning from it. As summer settled over the memorial garden, bringing with it a profusion of wildflowers and the gentle sound of bees among the blossoms, visitors came from across the country to pay their respects, some descendants of victims, others simply drawn by the story of justice long delayed but finally delivered. Among them was Elizabeth Chambers, great-granddaughter of Alexander Fleming, who had spent his life searching for Margaret Thornton without ever discovering how close she truly was. At 91, Elizabeth had lived to see the mystery that had haunted her family for generations finally solved. "My grandfather used to say that some wounds can't heal because the truth that caused them remains hidden," she reflected, seated on a bench near the memorial. "I think he would find peace knowing that Margaret has been found at last, that she's been properly laid to rest, that the man who took her from him has finally been exposed." She paused, gazing at the list of names etched in stone. "But I wonder too, how many other stories like this are still waiting to be discovered? How many other families are still wondering what happened to someone they loved? How many other killers believed they had gotten away with their crimes, taking their secrets to the grave? It's a question that continues to haunt investigators, historians, and communities throughout the Midwest. As the Willow Creek case demonstrated, the past is never truly buried. It waits beneath the surface, its secrets preserved in soil and stone, in forgotten documents and faded photographs, in stories passed down through generations. And sometimes, when the conditions are right, when drought brings buried bones closer to the surface, when renovations disturb long undisturbed ground, when a single discovery leads to connections no one had previously made, the truth emerges, bringing with it both the pain of confronting horror and the possibility of healing wounds that have festered in darkness for too long. For Margaret Thornton, Catherine Donovan, Laura Mitchell, Melissa Warren, and all the other women who fell victim to the preservationists' twisted ideology, justice came too late to save their lives. But it came nonetheless, restoring their names, their stories, and their humanity after decades of silence. As twilight fell over the memorial garden, casting long shadows across the grounds where the Hargrove mansion had once stood, a solitary visitor remained, a young woman who had come to leave flowers at the monument. She was 22, the same age as Margaret Thornton when she disappeared, and she wore an engagement ring that caught the last light of day as she placed her bouquet among the others. She had no personal connection to any of the victims, she explained to the caretaker, who was preparing to close the gates for the evening. She had simply been moved by their stories and wanted to pay her respects before her own wedding the following month. "It makes you think," she said quietly. "All these women, in different times but similar circumstances, how fragile happiness can be, how quickly it can be stolen." The caretaker nodded, having heard similar reflections from many visitors over the months since the memorial opened. "That's why we keep this place," he replied. "Not just to remember the horror, but to remind ourselves to be vigilant, to look out for one another, to recognize that evil often hides behind respectable facades." As the young woman turned to leave, she paused at the gate, looking back at the memorial illuminated now by subtle lighting that would burn throughout the night, a beacon ensuring that what had once been hidden in darkness would remain forever in the light. "Do you think they're all gone now?" she asked suddenly. "The men who did these things, do you think we found them all?" The caretaker didn't answer immediately. How could he? The investigation had revealed a network spanning generations, adapting and evolving over more than a century, its members hidden among respected professionals and upstanding citizens. Though arrests had been made and perpetrators brought to justice, the ideology that had driven the preservationists had proved remarkably resilient, capable of surviving the deaths of its founders and finding new adherents in each generation. "I hope so," he said finally. "But history teaches us to be vigilant. Evil doesn't disappear. It just finds new forms, new faces. The best protection is awareness, community, looking out for one another." The young woman nodded, seeming to take comfort in his words. As she walked to her car in the fading light, the caretaker watched her go, one of countless young women planning their weddings across the country that summer, living their lives, pursuing their dreams, unaware of the shadows that might be watching from a distance. For while Robert Crane and his known associates had been apprehended, certain passages in his journal remained troubling. References to brothers in the sacred work, whose identities had not been established, whose locations remained unknown. The preservationists had always been careful, always patient, always willing to wait for the right moment to act. And they had always been adept at finding new recruits to carry on their twisted mission. As darkness settled over Willow Creek and lights came on in homes throughout the town, the Memorial Garden stood as both a warning and a promise, a reminder that no matter how deeply buried, the truth will eventually find its way to the surface. And when it does, it brings with it both the pain of confronting the darkest aspects of human nature and the possibility of healing wounds that have festered in silence for too long. The case of the bride buried beside a man she never married had been solved. Margaret Thornton's story was known at last. But how many others remained hidden, waiting to be discovered? How many other killers believed they had gotten away with their crimes, taking their secrets to the grave? These questions hang in the air like a Kansas summer storm, distant thunder that reminds us of nature's power to both nurture and destroy. And like the prairie soil that had finally yielded its grim secrets, the landscape of human history contains layers upon layers of stories, some celebrated, others deliberately forgotten, all waiting for those with the courage and determination to uncover them. As the gates of the Memorial Garden closed for the night, the names of the victims remained illuminated, no longer forgotten, no longer erased from history. Their stories had been recovered from darkness, their humanity restored, their memories honored, and in that recovery, that restoration, that honoring, lay the possibility of ensuring that such horrors would not be repeated, that the vigilance of an awakened community might prevent future Margaret Thorntons from disappearing without a trace. For in the end, it is not just justice that protects us from the darkness that lurks at the edges of civilization. It is awareness, compassion, and the refusal to look away from uncomfortable truths. The story of Willow Creek and the preservationists reminds us that evil thrives in silence and secrecy, in the spaces we choose not to examine too closely, in the histories we prefer to forget. But it also reminds us that truth, no matter how long buried, has a way of emerging into the light. And when it does, it brings with it the possibility of healing, of justice, and of ensuring that those who were lost are finally found, their stories told, their humanity affirmed. No longer just bones beneath the soil, but individuals whose lives mattered, whose futures were stolen, whose memory deserves to be preserved, not in death, but in the ongoing story of human resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. As you reflect on this disturbing tale from America's heartland, remember that while this particular story has reached its conclusion, countless others remain untold, buried in forgotten files, in unmarked graves, in family mysteries passed down through generations. The darkness that allowed the preservationists to operate for so long exists in every community, in every era, waiting for the right conditions to flourish. But so too does the light of truth, the persistence of those who refuse to let the missing remain forgotten, the courage of communities willing to confront their darkest chapters. And it is this light, this persistence, this courage that ultimately ensures that justice, though delayed, is not forever denied. As for the bride buried beside a man she never married, Margaret Thornton, whose disappearance in 1889 launched an investigation that would span more than a century, she rests now in hallowed ground, her name restored, her story known, her memory honored. And in that restoration, that knowledge, that honor, lies a kind of peace that transcends the horror of her final moments. A reminder that while evil may claim lives, it cannot erase them from history if we refuse to look away, to forget, to surrender to the comforting darkness of not knowing. The truth waits beneath the surface, in soil and stone, in forgotten documents and faded photographs, in stories passed down through generations. All it needs to emerge is someone willing to dig deeper, to ask difficult questions, to follow the trail wherever it leads, even when it leads to horrors we would rather not confront. In the end, this is not just a story about murder and obsession, about justice delayed but finally delivered. It is a story about the power of truth to transcend time, to connect generations, to heal wounds that have festered in darkness for too long. For those who seek a higher power in times of darkness, remember the words inscribed at the entrance to the Memorial Garden in Willow Creek. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. In the face of evil that spans generations, that hides behind respectable facades, that preys on innocence and perverts beauty into horror, this ancient promise offers both comfort and challenge, a reminder that darkness, no matter how pervasive, cannot extinguish the light of truth if we refuse to look away, to forget, to surrender to the comforting illusion that such horrors belong only to the past. And it is a reminder that no matter how deeply buried, the truth will always find its way to the light. The story of Margaret Thornton and the preservationists is now known. But how many others remain hidden, waiting to be discovered? How many other families still wonder what happened to someone they loved? How many other predators walk among us, hiding behind respectability while nurturing dark obsessions? As you lock your doors tonight and settle into the comfort of your home, remember that vigilance is the price of safety, that awareness is the beginning of protection, that community is our strongest defense against the darkness that lurks at the edges of civilization. And remember, too, the women of Willow Creek, whose stories remind us that justice, though delayed, need not be denied if we have the courage to unearth the truth, no matter how long buried or how deeply disturbing. For in that courage lies our humanity, our refusal to look away from suffering, our determination to honor those who were lost, our commitment to ensuring that such horrors are not repeated. And in that humanity lies our hope, that evil, though persistent,